11 months ago, one of the most extraordinary minds to grace the Jewish people in many generations left us. My father, known by some as Hakham, by others as Dr. or Professor Favor, and then by some as just the Hakham, was a prodigiously gifted scholar of Torah, linguistics, philosophy, and many other disciplines. He was a man who had a memory that was not just photographic, but it was integrative and encyclopedic. He was the living personification of the verse, Ve'arita bo yomam v'layla. He literally spent his days and nights studying. I said that he left us. The word died may suggest that his mind stopped studying Torah, that his mind stopped generating insights. But this is not true. He was always, till the very last day, studying Torah, thinking about Hiddushim, having new insights. But he did leave us. My father was an enigma. On the one hand, he was a world-renowned scholar, researcher, and writer, writing about such little-known fields as the Masorah for the Targum Ankelos. Anybody know what the Masorah for the Targum Ankelos is? And whether this Masorah was developed in Babylonia or Israel, examining the different systems of vocalization of the Masorah, examining why the Targum was not written. The Targum Ankelos originally was not written, but the Masorah was written, explaining what the function of the Masorah served. Truly a scholar, truly a professor in every way. But I said he was an enigma. I remember walking with him as a young child. It was near Greenwich Village. And my father used to frequent the area because it had some bookstores. And my father didn't have too many addictions in his life, but he did have one: books. He was always buying books on science, on philosophy, on structuralism, on post-structuralism. He was always reading. Anyway, so we're walking around Greenwich Village. There's this black homeless person, and I'm about to go, I'm like just want to go a little further. And my father actually approaches him, and they strike a conversation. The former person, meaning the homeless man, apparently recognizes my father from previous encounters because my father would always talk to him, and they have this fun conversation going on. So my father embodied the idea of Haveh mekabelet kol ha'adam besever panim yafot. Literally every person that my father knew, he respected the person. Didn't matter what his standing was in society. So I said he was an enigma. So he was so obsessed with learning, with Torah study, that Dr. Philip Miller, the librarian in Hebrew Union College, a place frequented by my father. As you know, my father was a researcher, and that library has tremendous collections of monographs of ancient books. Anyway, he relates how once my father is seen entering the library, and he's holding in his hand luggage. So Dr. Miller says, "Professor, what are you doing with the luggage?" And my father said, "Well, I just came off a plane." He says, "Well, I figured that much, so why are you not going home?" So my father showed Dr. Miller a cocktail napkin, and on the cocktail napkin, he was writing certain insights about who knows what, and he just couldn't help himself. He needed to go to the library. He needed to find that book to confirm something he just wrote. So with the luggage, he gives it to Dr. Miller. "Please watch it for me." My father goes to the reading room. This just couldn't wait. So my father, a man obsessed with learning, published close to 10 major books, published over 100 articles, a man who was invited to lecture all over the world in various languages, in English, in Hebrew, in French, in Spanish. These are languages he gave public lectures, and he spoke many more languages, and I probably missed something. He had a charming personality, and he would take the simplest person and turn him into his friend. Anybody visited my father in Netanya Law School, where my father founded the comparative law program in the law school. So anybody visiting my father would be able to relate, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who experiences this. I just experience it almost on a regular basis. So I entered the law school, and of course my father introduces me to all the people. So there's professor this, professor that, all these, distinguished scholars in the law school. But here's the odd thing. The security guard, he would tell me, you don't understand who your father is. I'm like, well, okay. And he's talking to my father like the best friends. The cleaning lady, oh, God bless you. The people in the copy room. There wasn't a person in the law school, from the highest ranking professor to the dean of the school to the lowest ranking person, that didn't come over to me. Oh my gosh, you don't know who your father is. I'm like, I think I do, but maybe I don't. And I guess I really didn't, because all these people felt that my father was their friend, and they felt so comfortable next to my father. So like, I'm the son of their best friend walking into the law school. So I was a student at Columbia University. I used to join my father because, as you know, he was a professor. Some of you may know he was a professor in Jewish Theological Seminary. So I used to join him for breakfast sometimes, bagels and coffee in the morning. I remember Jimmy. Jimmy was a cafeteria cook. He was from Puerto Rico. And my father and Jimmy used to love speaking Spanish together like best friends. They were like buddies. So anyway, once Jimmy asks my father, El Rabino Jose, dígame. He says, Professor Faur, Rabbi Faur, please, can you tell me something? Because my father was a professor of Talmud. He says, I want you to tell me what is the Talmud. Summarize the Talmud for me in a sentence. And without skipping, I'm like, oh, how do you do that? I'm kind of thinking about this. What's the answer to that? Without skipping a beat, my father replied in Spanish, and boy, do I regret not writing this down. But I can say it in English. My father says, Jimmy, you know what the Talmud teaches? You know what the essence of the Talmud is? It teaches that life is a dance, and you must learn how to tango. And boy, was Jimmy happy. He was like, he got it, he understood. So here's the enigma. Only Hakham could argue with the great Professor Saul Lieberman, probably one of the greatest Talmudists of several generations. He was a walking Gaon Levila. Only my father, Hakham Faul, could argue with Professor Saul Lieberman about the authenticity of a particular letter written on the side of an ancient Talmudic manuscript. And they would have these arguments whether the letter is authentic, whether it was added later on. Only my father could have that discussion with Professor Lieberman in one moment, and 5 minutes later be explaining to Jimmy what rabbinic thinking is about. Some people are humble, and that's great. Humility is great, but it's oftentimes contrived. My father's humility was in his very DNA. It was organic to who he was. He was a person who loved life. He loved people. And, when you love people, it's just, you're just going to be nice to everybody. And that's how my father was. But I want to talk about something else. As a rabbi, there was not a place where my father visited where he did not leave an indelible mark. One day, I want to speak about what my father did in this community. Now's not the time. I can tell you, and people who know the history know that my father attracted hundreds and thousands of people to study Torah in the future. Let's shift. Let's shift to Buenos Aires, Argentina. What I'm now going to tell you, I know as a fact, because it was related to me directly by none other than the president, or the former president of the Sukkot David Kehillah, who told this to me, and he wanted me to know what happened in Argentina when my father visited the community, the Syrian community in Argentina, because as you know, my father was born there, and later on he left, he studied, and then he came back. When my father returned in 1965, he began giving classes in Argentina in the Syrian community. My father attracted on any given night hundreds of people into the synagogue. This was not the norm. This did not happen. On one night, there was 300 men and 300 women present in the synagogue. On that night, my father spoke and he gave a derasha. He gave a derasha, and he started as follows. He said, do you love your children? It goes up. Well, yeah, of course we love our children. So he gave a derasha, and as the president of the synagogue tells me, he calls it the Ibn Halal and Ibn Haram speech. The crowd listened as my father explained how important it is to go to a mikveh, not just important, essential. And it's not just important for the couple, it's important for the children, because as the Gemara tells us, and my father used the Arabic word, that chas v'shalom, if they don't go to the mikveh, the child is Ibn Halal and Ibn Haram. That's a very heavy thing to say in public. He said it in public. And people were like, they were stunned. Anyway, a few days pass. The caretaker of the mikveh calls up the president of the synagogue. Says, hi, how you doing? Says, yeah, doing good. Anything you want to tell me about? Says the caretaker to the president of the synagogue. Anything you want to tell me about? Says, no. What's going on? Says, so can you tell me something? Because usually we have one person on any given night, one person every 2 nights in the mikveh. Well, what's going on? The president says, well, what do you mean? He says, I have a line of people outside the mikveh. I don't know what to do with all the people. We never had so many people coming to the mikveh before. That's the mark that my father left in the Syrian community in Argentina. That's his credit. That's what he did. I want to give you another speech he gave. These are all speeches. I spoke to the president and he was just going on and on about what happened. He lives in Israel now, and that's how we got together. So he's in the synagogue, and there's a person who finishes Shabbat morning services, goes to the horse races. Horse racing, I guess, was popular in Argentina in the 60s. He goes to the horse races, he bets money on the horse races, and my father didn't like this. So the next Shabbat, my father gets up in the synagogue, he gives a class on the following pasuk in Tehillim. There's a pasuk that says, Sheker hasus lichu'ah ubrot chelo lo yimaret. The peshat of the pasuk is, if you're going to war and you think the horse is gonna, you have these great weapons. So in those days, a horse was a great weapon, right? So if you have a horse and you think you're gonna win the battle because you have this horse, that's not what brings victory. That's a lie. So anyway, my father goes on in the synagogue and he says, Sheker hasus lichu'ah. If anybody thinks they're going to become rich going on Shabbat to the horse races, it's a lie. It's not going to happen. Nobody gets money from working on Shabbat, from making chilul Shabbat. Anyway, this guy heard the derasha, and I can tell you what happened to this guy. He became shomer Shabbat. His children became Talmidei Hachamim, they became rabbis. His grandchildren are Talmidei Hachamim who teach Torah in public. That's the power that my father's words, had when he would speak. Growing up with my father, there really was no such thing as a dull conversation, meaning, yeah, hi Dad, how you doing? Okay, good. Like, what's the weather like? It just, that type of stuff just didn't happen. It was always, he would tell me a chidush in Torah, something that he was reading, and then he would say, okay, give me a chidush. I'm like, I'm in the middle of work, and I always, I don't have a chidush. Like, it's not on my, tell me a chidush. When you don't have a chidush, he would get upset at me. Like, how? Yeah, I'm calling you up, or you're calling me. How are you not talking Torah to me? Like, how can that be? Anyway, so I'm here now, and I'm not going to pretend like I understand everything. I don't. But I want to say this to my father. So I'm reading this book that my father left me. It's Givat Shaul. It was written by Rabbi Shaul de Montera, 17th century chief Sephardic rabbi in Amsterdam. One of the great Hachamim. His Talmidim was Moshe Zakuta, for those of you know. But the author of Birkat Kohen. He was a good friend of the Hakham Serir, Ashkenazic rabbi. And anyway, I'm reading this book, and I'm thinking about, what am I going to say? It's Parashat Halemot, yesterday, Parashat Halemot Kedoshim. And in his discourse on yesterday's parasha, he talks about Yom Kippur, because as you know, yesterday's parasha was talking about the Kohen Gadol entering the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur. And Rabbi Shaul points out that every holiday has a specific message. So for example, what's the message of Shabbat? The message of Shabbat is the world was created ex nihilo, yesh me'ayin. There was nothing. Hashem created the world out of this complete nothingness. That's a message of Shabbat. What's the message of Pesach? The message of Pesach is God governs the world. People think that petty politicians govern the world. Petty politicians do not govern the world. God governs the world. Here's an example. Paro, that's all he was, a petty politician. He didn't govern it. What's Shavuot about? Shavuot is Torah mehashamayim. Hashem gave us Torah, and we are his people. We follow his Torah. What is Sukkot about? Sukkot is about the special divine providence that God, Kadosh Baruch Hu, has for the Jewish people. What's Rosh Hashanah about? Rosh Hashanah is about the fact that God judges the world. And what's Kippur about? Kippur is the day of Kapara. It is the day of Kaparat Avonot. But there's an underlying concept. There's an underlying concept in Kippur that is the foundation of the Kaparat Avonot. That's what you should be thinking about on Kippur. And if you think about that, that's where the Kaparat Avonot lies. So what is it? So the Bishop Levi Mortera explains that Kippur is about the unity of God. It is the idea, not just that there is one God. It is the idea that this one God expects us to address him directly through no intermediaries. What happened right before Kippur? What happened before Kippur? The Jewish people did the Egel HaZahav. What happened on Kippur? Hashem forgave them for the Egel HaZahav. Why did Hashem forgive the Jewish people for the Egel HaZahav? Because the idea of you pray to God directly. Get rid of those kemiot. They're a waste of time. They're a waste of money. They're an insult to human intelligence. To think that a kamiyah is going to help you, to think that all these silly things that you see in different religious magazines are going to help you, that's all nonsense. You have a problem, speak to God. Don't do tricks. That's the idea of Yom Kippur, but it's more than that. It's not just that you should worship one God directly, but when you worship this one God, you worship him through the one law that he gave you, the Torah. Don't make things up. Don't add things. Don't subtract things. Be a little humble. He gave us a Torah. That's how we worship God. That's the central idea of Yom Kippur, and I'm going to show it to you now. This is from the Bishop Levi Mortera, and I know my father would have loved this because we always used to discuss the Torah, and I know the things that he used to love. So, several ideas, the symbolism of unity on Yom Kippur. All holidays, when you went to the Beit HaMikdash, you had many Kohanim performing the services. On Yom Kippur, how many Kohanim did you have? One. Only the Kohen Gadol. All holidays, the Kohanim wore multicolored clothing. On Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol was performing the services for Yom Kippur, he wore pure white clothing, again symbolizing the idea of unity, symbolizing the idea of purity. And what pasuk did we repeat in the Selichot over and over and over again on Yom Kippur? Adonai hu ha'Elohim, Adonai hu Elohim, and then we say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We repeat the idea of unity over and over again, because that is the central theme. On every holiday, we satisfy our physical selves, delicious food, great meals, go out, have fun, be with your family and friends, and study Torah. But this combination, on Yom Kippur, it's only one thing. It's only the spiritual, intellectual aspect of our existence. And you know what? I think it is so fitting that this arayat today, here, is right after the day that we read about the Kohen Gadol entering the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur. Because my father was born on Yom Kippur. And I truly believe that through the Torah he studied, he entered the Kodesh HaKodashim. And you know what? If I had to summarize, if somebody said, summarize for us, what is the most important lesson? If I had to take all of my father's books and all of my father's writings and distill it into a single idea, it is the very idea that is encapsulated in Yom Kippur, the day he was born. And that idea is personal responsibility. There is one God You must follow the mitzvot that this one God gave us according to the instructions he gave us and take personal responsibility. Follow his laws. And I want to end with the following. My father had a dream and he had a vision. He dreamt about Andalusia, about the cities of Sevilla, Lucena, Cordoba, Granada, great centers of Torah learning. He dreamt about the Hachamim, on whose lips was the wisdom of the Gemara. He dreamt about Rabbi Yosef ben Megas, Rabbi Yitzhak al-Fasi, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Gayat, Rabbi Baruch ibn al-Baliya, Rabbi Maimon Dayan, of course, Harambam. That was his dream, but he had a vision. His vision was to take the wisdom of our Hachamim and to bring it forward into a modern context. And he did it in his writings, and he did it in his articles. And I want to make an announcement. The announcement is related to my father's laptop. My father wrote a lot of books. They were published. My father published a lot of books. On his laptop, there was an incredible mass of information. On his laptop, there are entire books that were not published. Entire books. I mean, he has a book on Iyunim b'Mishneh Torah, which is completely edited almost. I mean, it just literally has to be taken and given for publication. I have established a tax-free foundation. It is called Varon Yosef. The purpose of this foundation is to take my father's writings, republish the ones that were written, but more importantly, to take the writings of my father that were not yet published and publish those writings. I can't tell you how many people reach out to me. We can't find this book. Where can you get us a copy of the book? I can't. It's out of print. Can you get us that article? The article's okay. We're starting to organize. So this is what we're doing. My father left us. He's in Olam Haba with Harambam and the great Hachamim. But our job here, and where I want to continue building nether with Hashem's help, is to really spread his wisdom to all of Am Yisrael, so it's accessible there for everybody's life to be affected in a positive way.
So now the rabbi announced his foundation. So now we have to fund it. This is what better time in his honor and his memory. So on behalf of my family and I, we're going to donate $3,000 to the, what's it called?
Varon Yosef.
Varon Yosef Foundation. So we get, let's fund this up and let's I can't wait to read the books. We go around. Bernie Flom, $500. Ellie Cohen, $1,000.
Varon Yosef, anyone for the book? How many?
Murray Miz,
$3,000 over here. Baruch Hashem. Anybody else? Over
Stephen
here,
Levy,
$500.
One second, slow down.
Anybody else? Hold on, over here.
Alan Levy, $1,800.
$1,000. Levorach Hashem. Anybody else? I forgot him? Over here, 500.
What's over here's name?
David Tommy.
Okay.
Hold on. 500 over here.
Okay, Janani.
Eddie Mish'an, 500. I pronounced it good, Anybody else that I forgot?
There's one other stipulation.
What?
We have to buy the books.
Of course. All right, so I'm gonna try to approach you after, because we're gonna try to record, and the money is going to be sent to this synagogue
Yes.
on a check. We're going to make it out to Ohel David and Shlomo, and then you write it on the caption,
Vayan Yosef.
Vayan Yosef. I'm not going to remember that. Just write the
Vayan
Yosef
Yosef.
Award
Yes.
Foundation. Okay.
300.
300.
Please approach Albert and Isaac.
Okay, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have two more rabbis speaking, and I thank you so much for your patience. I also appreciate the fact, I know there's a lot of people on Zoom, there's a lot of people live, definitely appreciate that. We have two more, we have Rabbi Jack Varon from the city, we have Rabbi David Bitton from Great Neck. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Hakham Yosef Mizrahi. Thank you for coming. I also want to acknowledge the previous presence. I don't see him now. Rabbi Marlon Yadav from Kehilat Yeshurun. I don't see him now, but it's fine. He was here. So I apologize if I'm missing anybody. I'm sure that there might be additional people.
Is this live? I'm going to put it on this.
Yeah, it is live. Yeah, it's live. So please, Hakham David, please join us. And then we'll have Rabbi Jack joining us as well. Thank you. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. Perfect. That's good. That's good.
Okay, you can take it. I got it. Just check the volume.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how to do that.
Hakham Abraham. It's nice to be here with a lot of familiar faces. In our Friday night dinner in my family, it's a little bit different than most families. We generally have sushi for Shabbat. And some people find it a little bit odd. But in my family, if you were to ask one of my daughters or my little son who's 3 years old, what's their favorite food, all of them would tell you the same thing: sushi. We are a sushi family. And you can imagine when in 2017, while we were living in Shanghai, China, we had a few days off and we decided to take a little trip to Japan, how excited we were. The highlight of our trip was the Tsukiji market in Tokyo, maybe the most famous fish market in the world. It was an incredible experience. The highlight of that Tsukiji market was a little shop that I still remember it as I'm speaking to you, and my mouth is a little bit watering as I'm remembering that experience, that the only thing they sold was fresh tuna. That's it. Nigiri. No rice, just fresh tuna. And not any fresh tuna, but the best possible toro, the belly of the tuna. It was incredible. It was fantastic. Glad kosher and amazing, incredible. And you know, my wife likes very much making sushi. And we thought maybe we could take a class. We're in Japan, we're in Tokyo. Maybe we could learn in Japan how to make sushi, how to become sushi men. But we were wrong. You see, in America, if you want to learn how to make sushi, you go online, you Google how to make sushi, and for $17.99, you could log in and participate in a 5-week course, and at the end, you get a certificate of a sushi man. But in Japan, you can become a sushi man in 5 weeks. In Japan, they have what's called itamaki. The itamaki is the best of sushi. It's the master of sushi. And you cannot become that in 5 weeks, not even a year or 2. It takes 10 years to 20 years to become an itamaki. And in fact, in those decades of learning, the apprentice who comes to learn starts at the very, very bottom. And after 5 years, they say, after 5 years, he's permitted to finally prepare by himself rice, nothing else, only the rice. So we gave up on the idea of becoming a sushi man in a 3-day trip in Tokyo. That wouldn't work. And you know, it was enjoyable being in Japan, but it was also a little bit difficult coming back or coming to the United States. The sushi wasn't the same anymore. When we came to a sushi restaurant in New York, we had beautiful memories of great, fantastic sushi beforehand. But after trying the sushi of Japan, after trying that fish, that toro, it wasn't the same anymore. My friends were telling me, were raving, there's this great new sushi place. They put a little bit of gold leaf in the sushi. They even put cream cheese and spicy mayo. Beautiful, I told them, but I was in Japan. Beautiful, but I was in Tsukiji market with a person who, when cutting the tuna, had a very, very long knife and did it with perfection, with precision, with authenticity. Am Israel, we are not great at making sushi, but we are something better, which is the Torah. The sushi started in the 731 years ago or so. In the year 731, 1300 years ago. Our Torah precedes that by a lot. Their masters spent 10 years to 20 years to perfect their craft. Ours are called Hachamim, and they spend much longer than that. They care about our Torah, our real Hachamim. They care about our Torah. They care about the letters of the Torah more than what the masters of sushi care about their sushi. And Hakham Faoud was a true master. What a master. How much he cared, how much he dedicated to study Torah. How many years he spent learning and perfecting. As Hakham Abraham said, every letter he cared about so much. The rigor by which the masters prepare the sushi, they see that a real itakamai, they prepare the sushi in a way that all the rice are directed in one direction. I remember what an experience it was to sit with Hakham Faoud in a Gemara class, in which nobody wanted to read. They were all scared. You know, if I read, I'll make a mistake. Because if a person would dare to say Tana without a dagesh, in a place that a dagesh belonged, he wouldn't let that happen. He would jump and say, hey, no, that's wrong. How could you read without a dagesh where a dagesh is in place? He would tell us, if you don't know how to say the he of Abraham, the he of Yitzhak, and the ayin of Yaakov, you cannot study anything else. And, you know, I say Hakham Faoud over here, but I don't consider myself his student. Not because I don't follow his way, but because I'm still learning how to make rice. And also because I never called him Hakham. I called him Tio Jose. He was my father's uncle, my grandmother's brother, and our great uncle. And I had with him, I believe, a very special connection. He loved me very, very much. I felt that, and I loved him back very, very much. And he was my uncle, but he was also, you know, I grew up in a house in which my father would tell us, you know what's the most valuable thing we have? The most valuable thing we have is the los cassettes del Tío José, he would say, are the recordings, are the tapes of Tío José. And I remember as a child looking at all those tapes and my father listening to those classes and writing them down and trying to digitalize them. And you know, now that it's been 11 months, what happens sometimes is that if you stay too long in America, you might forget what real sushi tastes like. And I truly miss listening to the wisdom of Hakham Faoud. And I truly miss, you know, I didn't call him enough, but I wish I could call him a little bit more. I wish I could call him again and hear from him a little bit more of that tradition, of that Torah that he presented and that he lived in such a beautiful way. So, you know, I think we have an obligation, as you said, to love our Torah more than what the Japanese love their sushi. That our masters should dedicate more time to perfect their knowledge of Torah more than what the Itamakis spent time perfecting their craftsmen of sushi. And looking at Hakham Faour, looking at his legacy, remembering it, and seeing it as an inspiration is the best possible way that we can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Rabbi from the city, Rabbi Jack, what's the name of your Kayla? Rabbi in the Sephardic Minyan in Hesped. Please join us, Jack.
I have to say that this kahal, this kahal must be very privy to have such a great Hakham, to merit, to have the zechut of having my uncle, Hakham Faour's son. This is not a joke. This is really what it means, Kedoshim Tiyu Leloichem. Apparently, this is really Kahal HaKadosh. To have such a Hakham, my uncle, Rabbi Faour, B'shutcha. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of Rabbi Yaakov Bitton, Rabbi David Bitton, my teacher, my father. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my mother, who's also my teacher, my aunt, my grandmother, Eshet Chaya, Noda B'She'arim Bala. I'd like to acknowledge Rabbi Mizrahi and Rishut Harav, if I may. I have a powerful, epic quote that I would not have the audacity to say on my own. Now, the author is a good man, but okay, he's a good man. But listen to what he says. What Judah the patriarch, the Yehuda Nasi, accomplished through the Mishnah, a document unique in the history of Judaism, decisive and influential from its day forward, and what Harambam, through the Mishneh Torah and the Guide to the Perplexed, is what Rabbi Dr. Faour has done for our generation. That's a heavy quote. It happens to be that Dr. Jacob Neusner is a good man. He's a man that translated the entire Talmud Yerushalmi into English. I don't have an intimate relationship with his work. I know that he wrote this beautiful, epic, gorgeous intro to my grandfather's Golden Doves. And apparently, the word on the street about him, that he was the dominating voice in the academic world of the last century. But apparently he had it right. And with your permission, I'd like to read this quote one more time, because I think it speaks volumes. And I'd like to break it down a little bit. What Judah the patriarch, the Yehuda Nasi, accomplished through the Mishnah, a document unique in the history of Judaism, decisive, influential. What Harambam, what Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon accomplished through Mishneh Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim, is what Rabbi Dr. Faour has done for our generation. These important words were presented by Dr. Jacob Neusner, who was the dominating voice in Jewish academia in the last century, correctly categorizing my grandfather as one of the most influential rabbinic figures in Jewish history and the Jewish future. As I always like to say, in my humble opinion, I believe that my grandfather's writings will be officially canonized by the Chachamim in Yemot HaMashiach. I really believe that in my heart. These beautiful and important words were presented by Dr. Neusner in the introduction to my grandfather's well-known work, Golden Doves and Silver Dots, which we all know well. What many don't know is that the Golden Doves and Silver Dots is God's response in Shir HaShirim to his beloved, Am Yisrael, who was inquiring on what pathway to choose in order to find her beloved, God, symbolized by the shepherd. In response to her inquiry, God replies to Am Yisrael, Navu lechayayich batorim, savarech b'haruzim, toreh zahav na'aseh lach im nekudot kaseh. Your cheeks are comely, they're beautiful, God tells his beloved nation. Golden doves and silver dots I will make for you. Shteda's work, my grandfather's work, defines the demarcations of Rambam's interpretive methodology, Rambam's approach to Talmud and Tanakh. Just like Israel would never be able to find the pathway leading her beloved after the destruction of Chorban Bayit Sheni, if Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi didn't compile the Mishnah, so too, if it wasn't for my grandfather's writings, golden doves, homo mysticus, horizontal, we too today would be lost in the ocean of perplexing rabbinic literature. It is for that reason that I am titling a little article that I'm working on with the inquiry itself of Israel as the title, namely, Et she'ahava nafshi echa tir'eh echa tarbis basahoraim. Israel asking God, who she yearns to love. She declares, Et she'ahava nafshi, my beloved, what pathways do you shepherd upon? There is only one man in a generation who has earned the audacity to directly ask God of his pathways. Similar to the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, Hodieni na derachecha, David, Horeni Hashem, darkecha. Ishteda, my grandfather, is he not the speaker of the words, declaring his love for God and inquiring of what pathways to lead Am Yisrael? Et she'ahava nafshi echa tir'eh. Is the speaker of these words not my grandfather? Of course, God's response is what he delivered to us, what he packaged for us in golden doves. Toreh zahav na'aselach. That was the response of God. But of course, there was an inquiry that preceded that response that he received. And that inquiry was, my beloved, what are the pathways that you shepherd upon? As many of you know, I do serve as the assistant rabbi for the last couple of years in Ohev Tzedek, an Ashkenazic shul on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The Shabbat before Pesach, I quoted a beautiful passage from the essays of the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, where he reminisces about his childhood experience of studying Rambam with his father. It reminded me very deeply of my own childhood experience of studying Rambam with my father, my grandfather, my uncle on Ocean Parkway and Avenue L, the good old days. Still feel the air. The Rav, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, with your permission, provides his readers with a beautiful vision, if you will, that transpired amidst an enthusiastic shiur. In his words, he describes it as follows. This is the Rav now. This is beautiful, by the way, what he says. It was if Harambam himself were with us in the room. It's the words of Rabbi Soloveitchik, describing the experience that he had at his father's shiur. Listening to my father's words. The Harambam, sat next to me, says the Rav. What did he look like? I don't know exactly. He seemed to look like an exceedingly handsome and good father. His name, with your permission, was Moshe, just like my father. Talk about enthusiastically engaging the text and encountering the author. When the author is a fellow man, we can even discover, that is, know the mind of the author, or perhaps discover his original intent, which of course is impossible when it comes to the Torah, considering its divine authorship, although we could perhaps encounter the author through emunah and the providence that God bestows upon us. In my grandfather's work, Homo Mysticus, It states the following on the topic of encountering the author in the text. This is the words from Homo Mysticus, and I quote. It's a beautiful quote. I have encountered in some books a man, rather than a philosopher or a savant or a thinker. When I encountered a soul, rather than a doctrine, I have exclaimed, but I have been this man myself, and thus I have lived with Pascal in his own century and place. And I have lived again with Kierkegaard in Copenhagen, and so with others. Are these phenomena not the supreme proof of the immortality of the soul? As I mentioned at the onset, Shteda's works are not only iconic in the broader scope of Jewish history, they properly placed Judaism on the appropriate trajectory towards Yemot HaMashiach. Sheyavo b'mhera b'yameinu, amen. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish my dearest grandmother a warmest tinachamu min hashamayim. May I also take this opportunity to send my deepest tinachamu min hashamayim, and we all have nechama to my aunt and uncle, my uncle Abi, Rabbi Faur, and his wonderful wife Ella, and my Aunt Miriam, and Uncle Stephen. May we all have nechama. And acharon Haviv, to both my mother and my father. Shteda would love to say that a son and a student are synonymous. If anyone was a son to my grandfather, it was my father. Chamisha talmidim hayu lo l'Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. My grandfather had 5 students. Of course, my uncle, my father, Hakham Varon Haleva, Hakham Moshe Maimon, and of course, Rabbi Bitton. And he had many grandchildren. I could speak from personal experience for some of my close friends from Flatbush. We all felt my grandfather's love. He had a lot of love to give. And with that, I'd like to just wish Be'ezrat Hashem that we do see the Messianic age soon to come, and we see those books canonized, b'mhera b'yameinu, where they belong, in the official library of Am Yisrael, with the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Tanakh. We should also see horizontal society, golden doves, Homo Mysticus, b'mhera b'yameinu. Amen.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful.
So we're going to pray out in about 2 minutes. I just got a text message, Esther Varon. She's literally really good at pray out. I really do appreciate everybody's patience. It means a lot to the family. So why don't
I have a little bit of a different take than everybody. Okay. Over this past year, in my grandfather's absence, I've been suddenly filled with the urge to ask him questions. Well, so many topics came up this year, I just wanted to pick up the phone and ask him for his thoughts. I understood that when somebody is no longer here with us, we are still able to have a dialogue with them. I could still ask and get an answer. I can look at his writings, but that isn't where I look for traces of his thought. I went back to what he showed me, his behaviors, and how he lived his life. I found many answers there. This was a man who broke walls. He questioned convention. He swam against the tide. He also raised his children in the community inside conventions. They sent their children to yeshiva Flatbush. I think it's important to note that both of my grandparents did not grow up in Brooklyn. They were both Syrian, so my grandfather was raised in Argentina, and my grandmother was raised in Israel. It can make sense that they joined the Syrian community in Brooklyn, but it's also not a given. It wasn't a default, it was a choice. They made the choice to be part of the people, to live within a community. Now, my mother, or Varon, and her sister, my aunt, Mimi Levy, and my uncle, Rabbi Iyar, all actively serve their community. This was a person who illuminated the golden age of Spain, opened up a path from which we come from, and the glory that lies inside of it. He was also a person who prayed in the nearby Chabad and would stay after shul for the shiur. This was a person who praised what it meant to be part of a nation, I will take advantage of my role as granddaughter now, daughter of his daughter, his oldest daughter, and share that my grandfather in his later years often whispered things in my ears. Messages he wanted me to know, and messages he wanted me to know about himself in case there's any misunderstanding. He reiterated to me over and over that he loved all Jewish people, all of Am Yisrael. This was a person who also explained to me and showed me that to be properly part of this nation, there was a relationship we were to have with modernity and society. This was a man who presented himself like a gentleman. He wore his blazer with gold buttons and a hat on his head when he stepped out. His outer appearance was groomed, and his engagement with others was just as thoughtful. He enjoyed coffee dates in Starbucks, and his mastery of language was impeccable. His words and pronunciation embodied the delicateness in which he understood language. This was a person who was a scholar, but he was not removed. He always had a book in his hand, and he always invited everyone to come and learn with him. Oftentimes, we hear about scholars having closer relationships with their studies than their loved ones. Though I will not argue the love affair my grandfather had with learning, his love for his family and the home that he had was the loudest. There is sometimes a quietness when a person is very happy. I saw this most when my grandfather's table was filled with his grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. A smirk would sit consistently on his face. I saw it in the moments when every bed in his home was filled with a grandchild, and the hallways of his home were filled with suitcases. Nothing was audibly louder than the appreciation he had for my grandmother. To me, this point is most important. My grandfather often praised Hashem for taking him down the road he did. No route was more imperative than the stopover he made in Haifa in 1962 when he met my grandmother. I believe my grandmother is at the center of all of his appreciation. There is no other person in this world that could have given my grandfather the life, the family, and the home that my grandmother did. There is no other woman who could have taken as good care of him. He knew that very much. He made sure we all knew it as well. This was a man who praised his wife. This was a man who, in the face of all his accomplishments outside, also built himself with my grandmother in the most lovely of homes. My grandfather always knew, no matter what, he had the spiritual, emotional, and physical comforts of his home. His body was at his center. What was within the boundaries of his home surpassed all. His home was the expression of the sanctity of family. Now, over this past year, my grandmother was with my family. Our warm home was only filled with more warmth, often in the shape of fresh sambusa and cat, and my grandmother's loving and caring presence. Well, the appreciation sinks in, all I can hear is the voice of my grandfather. All I can hear is the voice of his praise. I feel so lucky to have my grandmother in my home, and I understand very differently now what he means when he said how lucky he was. He was right. So going back to my main point, my grandfather, breaker of convention, taught me we cannot ask questions in a conventional way when a person is no longer alive, but we can still get answers.
אדוני חפש למען חוקו, ידין תורה והגיר יתגדל. הנה רבה. הנה אמרו אמיר. והעלה. ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
לא תסור ממנו לעמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב את עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבביך וכל נפשך וכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אלוקים בשדך עם לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, ושלחנו ידיך לקרבתם ושלך קוראים ושדלנו בלביך, והיו לך בדיניך וכתבתם וזרועיך ושלך, והיה עם שמות ישמעאל ושדי אשר אנוכי מצוותכם היום לאהבה את אדוני אלוהיכם ועובדו וחדרו ותקומו שלכם ונתתי ותעשיכם ואתם ועשתה לבניך ותירוש על ישראליך ונתתי עשר לסרטן וסבבת ישמרו לכם ונפתם אלוהיכם לסרטן ועברתם אלוהים אחרי משכח עליתם אלוהים אחריו אשר אדוני נותן לכם וישמתם דברי אלה על לבבכם לכם וקשרתם אותם לדרכם וגדלתם בדרכם ולימדתם אותם את דרכם לדבר בם ושתהיה אחד מלכך על הדרך שלך ומלך וקטן ובדרך שלך למען יבוא אליכם ומלכם עד האדמה שנשבעה אדוני לאבות את כדי השמיים על הארץ ויהיו לנו שלמו דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם ואז כל הסיסי ונתנו עשיתי את הכם והלכם בסיסי וראיתם אותו וסחרתם לסוף המים ועשיתם אותם ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי לכם ואתם זו לקחתם ומן תזכנו עשיתם אותם שיתם גדול של אלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר עושה לכם יסוסיים ואתם אלים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אדוני אלוהיכם אמת זה זמן תסגרו עלינו גרנו להם זמן בסלמו הפועל ומכי הגמנה ומכי אלה והסלם ושלגנו ונפשנו הסלם של מחי ולאכם ולאובנו חבריכנו אבות מהם ולתזמנו האלה הסלם סליגה קרוב ואותו מקים להם המקפל ואותו מוזן וגיון סיר וסימון דמונתן המעביד ברגע זה עשו ואתו נותן מצלם וכמות בה ראו בנים הגיעו לתום שופר הרמז לשמם ומה פתאום מצלם עליהם ושם איזה לכם שירה ושמחה רבה וכולם מי חמות עד באלים אדוני מי כמות ולכל הסלם דבר עלינו, ועובד לגן, יעד ולמוד לנו, אבל ונאמן, כי תדע אדוני את יעקב, ולאדום יחזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, ועל ישראל. תקשיבו להם שלום, אני מכיר לכם שלום, לא סעי לזה כמדה, מכיר לזה, ועוד שאין מילה למען, שאין למען מעשה מלאנו, וכאן אויב דרך אחרת, או ניסה לנו לרשע, שבוא ועשר, סתם לפנים עלינו, וסגר לצדנו, ושמוע סתנו לחיים ולשם על תר אדונן, כי יש אומרנו לסמרתה, וכל הרפעלה, לא ידעו לשם זה, ברוך אתה אדוני, שומר את עמו ישראל, לכל דבר עליו, אמן. יתבדל ויתבדל שמי רבה, יעמד יגרתי ימין מחותי לסם ולכלבי כלב נשיחי, יחד יכול, מי לא יכול, כלב וישראל, ולא יכול כלבים, אמן. יהי שמי הרבתה, וברך, יעלם להם ויברך, וישתבח ויפעל מתרומם, ויתבשם ויתהדר, ויתעלם את הלם שמלימושה מליחו, ויעלם להם גבולפתה, שירתם גבולת המלחמתה, דמינם מעלמה, ואימו אמן. אדוני אדוננו, נאדיר שמך לכל הארץ, יתגדל ויתקדש ברבה, יאללה דיברת ומתיה ומתמחתה וסבות כאלה וכאלה ושיחיה, ויהיה יכולים ולכל הכלים וסרבה, לא זכרים ואמן. יש לנו מברך, יאללה וממה יברך, תשתבח ויפעל וקרובו למסר ותדע ותדע שמי דבקה דריפו, ועל לנו וחתה שתה שמתה מחמתה, ואמינת הערבים ואמן, וקבל סורתה ואותנה עם סורתו, ובעוקנו לבית القرآن أبونا بشمية العالم ومن يشل نار الثاني شمية الطيب السبع يشرب الحمام الشذر الفرس بحقرا لرمح السلام لنقم إسرائيل بمؤمن وسي شلوم بمؤمن وبرعمة شمالين وقم إسرائيل بمؤمن إنوام الضمين ما سلكنا علينا وما سلكنا علينا ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידש לנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר היום 29 יום לעומר שם 4 שמות ביום אחד רחמן וחסד אבות אבותינו שכולם במנהל ימינו אמן. ארץ נתינה אולי ברכנו אלוהים אלוהינו ברכנו אלוהים תגיעי לפה סמלה לפה אולי כנראה תסודרה כעלמה דאגי בודו שאין לך כי עושה ברכת עליך מסר תחת תגולי עשי גדול כלות כלומר יחיד כאלה מחד פנים ואופן יודע שמעתנו קבל ושמע סרקתם ולודה כאמור שילה נועלות ניסה מעלי אני אומר עזים אבוני עושה שמונה אני אתן עוד מלאך אני שמריע איננו ויסר לנו שמחה וסליחני מלאך ומה השם שלא ילכת ובלעלה אדוני שמו המקורה ישמור השאלה אדוני ישמור סתך ובואך ואתה תעתודה יתקדש ויתקדש שמך ועם בתי ברח חילותי ויומתי בחותי וישמח וכנך יקרב לשכם יחד יחמון ובלפון חי לפתח ישראל והחללה
Y vibró, amén.
Como dice el Immanuel, vale poeta no me llame volar, ברוך אדוני מבורך, לעולם ועד. יקבלו כולם נודי אדוני, כי המלכות שלך היא ולעונה שלו בכבוד. כתוב כל כך, אדוני נודי, ונאמן, ואדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ויום יחד רק משמעת, ודוע כגבור שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד.
Now you're such a sound. Congrats. Good luck with that. Congrats. Man, you're from grandma.
Nice shul. Every time I come, I love the shul.
Lorenzo, this is your school. Well, this used to be a Turkish school, right?
No. They had Turkish, but it was Spanish Greenwald. They had Greek, they had Ladino.
Yeah, but not Portuguese. But Portuguese is in the city. That's
Right.
a whole different. That's how that is. Yeah. Right.
I thought you were
We took it over 40 years ago.
Conversation is so important.
Oh, well, I'm on TV.
I hope we didn't say anything
Hey,
bad.
how are you, Mr. Hassan? You have a great family, by the way.
The computer is about to die.
One better than the next. Every time I meet the Hassan, I'm like, thank you. Good
The
things.
computer's gonna die.
Good things. God bless you.
The computer's about to die. The computer's about to die. Huh?
I heard it, yeah.
Back in the day, that's when kids started to get great in Flacos. For the last 10 years, a lot of my students are really hungry. Nice to see you, Mr. Javier. Nice to see you. I know. And I feel used to it. Yeah, it's a nice job. He said it's beautiful. He said used to it. Stay down. He used to come up and say, I took it. He would say, stay. That's what he said. I think it was a proper Arabic, but he was doing his. It's the same shoulders. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Yes, it's the same shoulders. They got more formal. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't know. Yeah. You need to ask him. I used to wonder. I thought maybe we were different. I don't know if we were right. Maybe Murray knows. We're talking about Snega. It's the same shoulders. No, it's the same. I call it Snega. Why not Chito?
don't know. I don't know.
Nice to see you,
Excuse
brother.
me.
Nice
Zach
to see you.
Baruch.
Thank you.
Zach Baruch, good things for the family.
Amen. Nice to see you. Appreciate that. Yes. Okay. Okay. Hope I see you soon. Yeah. Oh, no. You kidding me? Great to see you. You look wonderful. I know I'm getting pretty cute here. My wife is a beautiful.
Your wife's problem.
Thank God I got my hair still. So. Hey, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Great, you too.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you.
Okay, nice to see you. Great to see you.
Take care
Regards
of
to
your
your son,
grandmother.
Rabbi Haber. In regards to your son, Rabbi Haber. Yeah. Yeah, I'm very fond of him. So Daniel, yes. Very good friends by Albert Anton. A little bit my age. Hey, right. Who else do I know? Oh, okay. So you're just here. So they like. I'm reading the whole situation. Because you're like a Manhattan Beach guy. No. Like you must live by the, the phallics. From here. That sounds familiar. I grew up in Brooklyn. Okay. You were the first one up there. I saw. Yeah. Uncle AB.
Yes.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. Hold on just 1 second. You spoke beautifully, but I want to tell you.
You had very nice conversation. Thank you. The fact that the Hakham, because the Hakham is applied, and therefore it has a deeper meaning. Very nice insight. Very much. Yeah. Taking notes in my mind. Yeah. Okay. How you speak and your tone. I'm gonna put everything. Hopefully we'll catch up. Okay. Great. I'm always listening, by the way, to your Golden Dove YouTube. Oh, you do? Okay. I go for a 20-mile ride. You in Georgia? Yeah. So the combination. I'm one of your regular Tommy D's. Very good. All right. Yes. Okay. Appreciate that.
I took the speaker, I didn't want to go plug it.
No, but what about, did you get like a battery?
Yeah.
Oh, you got that. Okay, and then this. And then
I stepped out.
it was beautiful. It really worked so well. I can't even tell you.
Okay, good.
It was amazing. You made a big difference.
Came back.